he was in kindergarten, we had a number of pretty negative experiences related to lower quality mental health services that were pretty traumatizing for him and for us. He was struggling a lot in kindergarten with behavior stuff and was sort of starting to be labeled as a bad kid. We were really lucky to have found Judge Baker. I don't honestly even remember how. Oh, I had seen something through work that was talking about how to find a camp for your kids. And there was a special consideration that the person presenting the information had made and said, you know, if there's something special going on with your kid, you might want to consider a camp that, you know, is really well versed in those issues. And I was so worried about, it was going to be the first year that he would be in a camp. And I was super worried about what that would be like. I was pretty sure he'd get kicked out, and found Judge Baker, and he had an amazing summer. It really was life changing for us as a family. And we continued after that first summer, we continued doing parent-child interaction therapy with Dr. Sarah, which we did for several months. And we had hoped to participate again in camp this year, but of course, life happened. So we've been involved for, I guess, about 2 years. Did I cover the question?
Great. Thank you, Sarah. And what I should have also mentioned is my role. I'm so sorry about that. So I am the Associate Director of the Center for Effective Child Therapy, which is our evidence-based training clinic at Judge Baker. So we have doctoral students who do the majority of our psychotherapy treatment, as well as some staff and faculty like myself who do some treatment. And then I also am the director of Camp Baker, which is our summer treatment program for kids ages 6 to 12 with ADHD. So I think what's actually really wonderful about the people on our panel is all of them have had experience with both sets of service lines at Judge Baker. So all have had children participate in Camp Baker, and all have had some treatment services at the Center for Effective Child Therapy. So I think are really able to talk a little bit about that continuum of care and what happens when maybe just that 6 weeks of camp isn't quite enough, like Sarah's talking about there. All right, thank you. That's what I get for doing this at the end of the day. But Millie, I will turn it over to you to introduce yourself, Javier, and some of your experience.
Okay, my name is Millie Estavillo. My son's name is Javier Estavillo. Javier is 13 years old. We found Judge Baker Children's Center when we were looking for summer camp, just like Sarah. But in my case, because my son is older, we have gone through all the different kinds of camps, and we could not find anything that was a match for him because of his ADHD. And I looked and looked, and for whatever reason, I didn't find Judge Baker until last year. And I wish I was Sarah. I wish I had found Judge Baker Children's Center when Javier was 8 or, you know, or even younger, because when Javier finished that camp, one thing that he said to me, and I almost cried when he said that, was, "Mom, I didn't know there were more kids like me out there." Because he's always thought, you know, he was labeled to, he was always getting in trouble. He would ask me a question like, "Mom, why am I always in trouble? Why do I always get in trouble?" And I tried to explain it to him. And we did other therapies outside of Judge Baker, but they didn't work well until, you know, I started therapy with you guys, with Sarah and another therapist. And it has been life-changing for us, not only for Javier. Javier is a happier kid, but we are happier, you know, as parents, because we actually know how to talk to him, how to help him. Before, we really had no clue. We were trying all these different things and nothing was working. So I just wish I had found found Judge Baker a lot sooner. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Millie.
Yeah.
All right. And I'll turn it over now to you, Jessie.
The word vomiter. All right, so I am Jessie Champion. I have 3 children. All 3 of my children are special needs and have ADD or ADHD. So we hit the alphabet soup jackpot. We have 2 of our children that have worked with Judge Baker, although I guess in a way all 3 have sort of been affected by Judge Baker. We started interacting with Judge Baker with our son Noel, who is now 7.5. He was 6.5 at the time. We had just moved to Massachusetts from North Carolina, and quite frankly, our family was falling apart because our son was falling apart. He could not hold himself together at all. And I actually had one of my therapists was who recommended Judge Baker to me as try this. Maybe this can help you. If you can help your son. And so we came in and we spoke with Sarah, and Sarah said, honestly, I don't know if camp will work for him. Let's try therapy first. And we went in and we did the parent-child interaction therapy first, which is often in the world called PCIT. So if you hear us talking about that, that's what we're talking about. And we did PCIT first. Noel did go on to do Camp Baker and was an absolute little rock star at it. Who would have guessed? He absolutely loved it. And this kid turned around 180 degrees. Does he still have issues? Absolutely. But do we have a toolbox that we can go to when he has difficult or challenging moments? Absolutely. And that is something that we didn't have before. What we had before was our complete, we either had a moment of frozen, or it was that fight or flight response, really, for us as parents. And we didn't have anything, we had kind of tried everything, we thought. And so we were just so very thankful, and we are so very thankful for Judge Baker. And so that's why I continue to sit on every panel that they'll offer me, because I really do feel like this is such a valuable service. So, yeah.
Thank you so much, Jessie. And thank you for all of you. I know everyone probably had a busy work day, and for making the time to be here for what I think is hopefully the start of ongoing sort of conversations and series. So I have a number of questions sort of prepared for our panel, just talking a little bit more about experience, but I also want to encourage those of you who are joining in to ask questions, because really the goal is for this to be as useful as possible for our community. And so we want to make sure that you understand and get all of your questions answered. I did put that PCIT link in the chat. That's for the international PCIT website. So you can read about it a little bit more there, and you can also see some information about it on our Judge Baker website. So I thought maybe a good place to start, actually, I'm scrapping some of the questions I had planned because I was listening to what all of you were saying. And one of the things that stuck out to me the most was, you said we had services before, but they didn't really seem to work. So I wonder if you could speak a little bit, each of you, about what you think is some of the difference between services you got elsewhere and some of the services that you felt were really effective in addressing your kids' needs. And I'll let you guys just chime in as you want.
I don't mind starting. So as I had mentioned, Leo was sort of identified when he was in preschool as starting to exhibit some behaviors that were hard to manage in school. And originally, the first thing we did was we actually went to occupational therapy, which was sort of helpful. They did an assessment, and they had sort of an idea that he had some attention issues going on, but also thought that perhaps some of what he was sensitive to was related to like sensory issues. And we did that for probably a good 6 months, and it was fine, but it wasn't really getting at the root of the issues, and it certainly wasn't allowing us to learn anything about how to manage him as parents. We had also had 2 interactions with child therapists, one who was quite good, who I think was, or who ultimately had suggested OT, and another, unfortunately, at our pediatrician's office, who was really terrible and really said some, I think, unprofessional things about Leo's diagnosis and issues in front of Leo and in front of me. And that made me feel really awful at the time, because I went to them to get help. And instead, she labeled him and said that she'd never seen a kindergartner behave the way that he did, which, come to find out, when we did end up at Judge Baker, Leo's a very high functioning kid. And there are a lot of kids who are, having a more difficult time in life than Leo. And that was, I think, first and foremost, I'm really grateful for that experience of being connected with other parents, to know that Leo is not the weirdest kid ever. There are lots of kids that are like him. And there are lots of things too that are special about him. I think that was what was hard, that didn't come through with other places, where it was like the focus was always on what the problems were, not on what his strengths were. And he does have a lot of strengths, but they often are masked because of his behavior. So, I mean, I am very grateful to everyone at Judge Baker, particularly Sarah, for seeing, what is so special about Leo, and for giving us like actual tools that we could put into practice in our lives that really helped us manage, like, similar to what Jesse said, like things were just kind of spiraling out of control, because as he got older and sort of was asserting himself more, I think he was manipulating us more and more, and we had no idea how to handle him. So, we got, instead of just getting labeled and being told that he needed to go on medication, I think we were given actual tools to help his behavior, which made a gigantic difference just in the time that he was in camp, and then more so when we did the therapy afterwards. And really, the community that we got to be a part of was really huge. And the support, I don't think we've talked about this yet, but there is a sort of a thread through the whole school year after Camp Baker to keep you connected and keep you learning those skills. And I think that's super helpful, because it's very hard to stay as vigilant on the skills as you really need to. So I super appreciate that, like, constant community and ability to check in with people.
So I just wanted to say, like, a lot of places will go to, for ADD and ADHD children, will go to medication. And I personally feel like medication is a valuable tool, and that is a personal decision for each individual family to make. But it's a tool. I think what is unique about PCIT and about Judge Baker's approach is that they allow the parent to become the therapist. They don't let the therapist therapy the child once a week and then go home to the same old thing. They don't do play therapy and then the child goes home and then they act out and the parent goes, "What are you doing? Why are you being so bad?" And they're right back where they were. What they do is they teach the parent how to do what that therapist was doing the whole time. So that now, 24 hours a day, you are able to give that child that positive reinforcement, that environment that they thrive in, that environment that they need to respond in a positive and responsive way. And honestly, when we think about it as adults, like when we go to work or we just interact with our partner or our friends, like who doesn't want that constant praise and that constant positivity, and like who doesn't want to live like that? And that's the piece that was really missing for us.
Thank you so much, both of you. Millie, anything to add?
I feel like they have said everything I would have said. In my cases, since Javier is older, we went through different kinds of therapy for a long period of time before we started the parent-child therapy with Judge Baker. But what I can say about what I had before that didn't work was because the therapy was either just for him or just for me, but never us. So what happened is just like Jesse said, we would come home and we still didn't know what to do. We didn't know what to do with Javier. Another thing, we did groups too, like group therapy for the kids where he went and did kind of like a play group, something like that. But that still didn't work because he didn't know how to apply it. Because he struggles with social skills, but he's getting much better now. So, but I think for us, it was like, I remember when I started, I think the parent groups is like a therapy for the parents, because you are like, oh my God, she's going through the same exact thing I'm going through. And you can relate, and knowing that other people are going through the same struggles you're going with your child really helps. Another thing is I realize at these meetings for the parents, like the things we were not doing correctly, the way we were speaking to him, and things that I thought were okay, but didn't know that it was reinforcing the wrong behavior on him, the words I was using or my attitude or something like that. Another thing I feel like I learned how to breathe. Take a break. And like, even when situations were really rough, I still was able, and my husband too, we were able to handle and deal with situations better. But I think the main thing is, like you said, like both of you said, is we are learning how to be therapists ourselves so we can help our child. And I think that's huge. That's something that all the other therapies we took were missing. That connection of the parent-child and how to teach our kids and understand them. Because that was another thing, is like understanding where he comes from and being empathetic and, and saying, I understand this is hard for you, Javier, but we need to try this now. And that, it was just the way we talked to him, and everything changed, and he's becoming a better person. We have become better people ourselves too. So that's what I have to add.
Thank you to all of you. And, as a clinician, I want to just put this into context, about how we talk about some of our services. And I think you're all speaking from your experience. And the way that we would talk about the treatments that we use here at Judge Baker, whether it's Camp Baker, where we use something called the Summer Treatment Program, or if it's at CECT, where we use the match protocol or parent-child interaction therapy. All of the treatments that we use at Judge Baker and that our trainees are trained in are what we call evidence-based treatments. So they are short-term, skill-focused treatments that have been proven to work sort of beyond what we call usual care. So Jesse mentioned, play therapy. Millie talked about talk therapy, group therapy. These are things that, everyone is using, but you want to know about sort of the specific components of that treatment when you're seeking out therapy. Hopefully some of those will be at Judge Baker, but we want you to just be informed consumers wherever it is that you go to get care. Most of our treatments are sort of rooted in something called cognitive behavior therapy or behavior therapy. And the structure of those treatments is that we provide psychoeducation, which is basically a fancy way of saying education and information about the problem area, about why that problem area exists, maybe the functions in the brain that made it that way, and the things that maintain it. And then the specific concrete skills that the child and the caregiver can use to address that problem. And then I think what all of you are also talking about, that coaching component, is we don't just say, here are the tools, go off and use them, but we really work with caregivers, especially to be sort of our co-coaches or co-therapists. So you all learn the skills because you're with your kids throughout the day. You're there when the problems happen. And it's really hard to use tools, and it's really hard to use them when, tension is high and emotions are high and kids are hungry or they're home all the time because they're doing Zoom learning. And so it's really the learning and the success, I think, is using the tools in the moment when you need to. And so we come at it from a sort of over-learning approach, where just knowing it is like, yeah, that makes sense. That sounds good. But to actually be able to use that in the moment when your kid is having a tantrum and maybe you're out to dinner and it's embarrassing, that's another level of skill to have. And so we do a lot of coaching of caregivers in using the skills with their child, and then encourage caregivers to keep using those skills when they're one-on-one with their kid. Would you guys say that's a good summary? Yeah. So like Jesse said, my goal is to literally make my job obsolete, get all of you to be, awesome child therapists, because we know there's plenty of people who need more help, and you're going to be around to help manage your kids' needs way longer than anyone like me should be. All right. Any questions from the crowd that anyone would like to ask before I move on to some other questions? Okay. Well, we had a couple openings where we started talking a little bit about parent groups. And so this is something that we offer through Camp Baker. So at Camp Baker, we run 6 parent training groups during the summer that are primarily didactic in nature, because we have a lot of skills to teach in a short period of time. But I think even in the parent groups, even though that they're heavy didactic in the summer, there's a lot of opportunity for people to get to know each other and to do a little bit of a check-in and connect with other kids or caregivers who might be in the program. And then we keep that parent group going monthly during the school year. So we check in October through May, once a month. And that's more of a sort of focus on how are we doing? What is it like to, parent a complex kiddo? What is it like to navigate school systems or peer relationships or vacations and holidays, some of the challenges that arise? What are also some of the problems that are really common in kids with ADHD, like anxiety or depression or sibling issues? And then we also connect as a community and give each other a lot of support or tips on how to implement strategies effectively. So I guess for our panel of parents, it would be great if you could talk a little bit about sort of maybe what you thought about those parent groups going into it, and what that value has been for you now that you've had some experience.
So for the parent group, so since we did the summer, we did the intensive summer, and then we did the monthly for the year after. And then this year, of course, because of, with COVID, we couldn't do summer camp. Javier couldn't do summer camp in person, but we still did the parent sessions. And what's interesting is like, although as we continue, we were going basically over topics we have gone through before the previous year, it was nice to go back to them because sometimes you forget, you're like, oh my gosh, I should be doing this. And it kind of gives you an opportunity to get better at it. And even though you might be listening to the same thing again, you always learn something new. Or there's another parent that's going through something different and you're like, oh, I should try that. So like, I feel like I could continue this forever because it's really helpful because it, and there's some skills that sometimes, you get too busy and like, oh, I haven't really been doing, our parent-child time. And maybe I should go back. Ooh. Are you guys getting all that? Public safety alert. Okay.
Okay, wear a mask, everybody.
Okay, sorry. It was really loud. But I've been wearing a mask. So I think it's every meeting you learn something new. Every meeting you realize something where you can improve upon. And so to me, the parent groups are key to the whole therapy, having those sessions. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, I was just going to say that not only is there always something that like you realize like, oh man, I've been saying that wrong, or like, ugh, I miss that. Like, I've totally been doing that wrong. Or, but like kids change. Like they're constantly a moving target. Like just when you think you got them figured out, they go and they shift, or they figure you out, and they're like, oh, that rewards chart that was working for you last week, that's not working anymore. So and you need help with that. Like, well, now what do we do? And another parent has great ideas about how to help you figure out that moving target. We had a rewards chart that we spent, Lord knows how much time we spent figuring out that rewards chart, and it worked beautifully for like a month. And then I realized they were manipulating toys off of me like crazy. And I realized we couldn't do that. We were going to go broke. And I realized it was way easier for me to handle doing just one-to-one rewards, just conditional rewards. And that was like this light bulb moment for me. And I wouldn't have had that if I hadn't had these parent interactions. So, and there are just so many times where you're sitting there and you just don't feel alone, which is just the real beauty of it, is just sitting in a room like this, which most people have their cameras turned on, but we're all sitting there and going, yes, yes. I know exactly what you're talking about. And there's something really comforting about that.
I think that as Leo's behavior started becoming more and more problematic in school, it was harder and harder for me to connect with other parents because I had a lot of shame around him and felt like there would be assumptions about my parenting commitment or skills or whatever because of the way that he was behaving. And what I really appreciate about, I was sort of starting to like self-isolate myself because I just didn't want to get into it with people, and I assumed that most people wouldn't understand what was going on with Leo, which I think was true. But what I have really appreciated from the parent groups was number one, knowing that I wasn't alone. I said that before. That was really huge to hear that I wasn't the only person who was like trying my hardest to do everything right as a parent and still having these challenges with my kid. Um, and I appreciated being able to hear, from parents, like Millie, who have experienced, more years of school with their kid, and hearing from parents who went through the IEP process, which we hadn't done when we first became part of the Camp Baker community, but subsequently did. And there's just always something to learn from somebody else. And frankly, like, I'm not sure who said it before, but it does feel like group therapy in a way. And just knowing that like other people are struggling, you can try a tidbit of information that somebody else shares that seems to work. It's nice to feel part of a community where everybody understands, because I just so often feel that in groups of kids and parents at school that I either I don't fit in or Leo doesn't fit in, and that can be really hard. So and the last thing I would say is I really appreciate the accountability, because learning the skills, especially learning them like this past summer when we were really starting to get out of practice, it gave us some motivation to like keep doing the skills that we had learned, and having those refreshers, especially during this really challenging time when everything is crazy, was super helpful. So I think there's a lot, and I almost would say that I get as much out of the parent piece of it as I do from, that Leo does from the therapy or the camp part of it.
All right. Thank you to all of you. That was super helpful. And I know personally, I think I also learned something new every single parent group as well. I think it's this awesome partnership where you guys all make me a better clinician. And, I'm hearing about some of the stuff that you feel like you get out of these groups. It's how to talk about this, or maybe, a metaphor or an example that just really, really sticks and, is so salient that they're some of my favorite things to get to do as a clinician. I have a couple other questions. One, there is a lot of controversy around diagnosis for ADHD. And most of the ADHD diagnosing happens by pediatricians. And normally it's filling out a questionnaire. And then if you're kind of screening into that questionnaire, having your child potentially put on stimulant medication. So I'm curious, in a two-part question, again, really bad at these multi-step directions, but I'm curious, how did your child get diagnosed with ADHD, if you feel comfortable sharing? And does your child know they have ADHD? If they do, how did you talk to them about it? I think that's something a lot of people are worried about sharing.
Sorry, Jesse, you want to go first? So in my case, at the beginning, it was starting school, just like Sarah said. Javier was in kindergarten. We held him back a grade because he wasn't mature enough. That was the reason at the time. But then we realized that holding him back a grade didn't really make much of a difference. Javier was still Javier with his ADHD. So that's when we decided, okay, maybe we need to go farther with this. So we ended up actually having him evaluated by a psychologist. And he came back with ADHD, combined. So, so that's when we started therapy. At the time, Javier was going to private school. So we stayed one extra year in the private school, but we realized that he needed a lot more services. Like the private school was able to set up a 504 for him, but they couldn't provide any services really. They did the accommodations, but not the services he needed. So we ended up getting services outside of the school, but then it couldn't translate to the school setting. So that's when we realized, okay, we need to put him in public school. So we ended up switching him to public school. And at the beginning, the school, because they don't consider, if your kid doesn't have a learning disability, they don't think he needs an IEP. And basically, because Javier didn't have a learning disability, we ended up with a 504 for a couple of years in the school. Then eventually having therapy outside, I talked to the psychologist at the school and I told them, listen, my son is having therapy outside, but that's not really helping because he's not putting it in practice at the school. Can we do anything? And they started providing services without an IEP. And then when they realized that the services were helping him and he had less problems having meltdowns in class and freezing because Javier also has anxiety, they realized, okay, this is really helping. So at the end, he ended up getting an IEP by default because he actually was already having the services, but he didn't have an IEP. So which kind of goes backwards in my case, but that's how it ended up working out. So what was the other part?
Have you talked to Javier about having
okay.
ADHD?
So Javier has been learning about ADHD because when we started the individual therapy, that was part of it, understanding ADHD, educating him. So we had like multiple books that we use, depending on his age, they changed, you know, they went from little pictures and then they got a little, so Javier knows a lot about ADHD and a lot of it comes from the therapy that he was taking previously and from reading books about ADHD. And also, he also has another therapy that he does, a group therapy, and they also talk about ADHD there. So he's an expert at it, and he sometimes try to use, oh, I have ADHD, and we told him, no, you cannot use ADHD as an excuse, sorry. So, but yeah, I think we did it mostly through the therapy and through books. That's how we talked to him about ADHD. But yeah, that's it.
Great, thank you, Millie.
So I think originally Leo was diagnosed with anxiety when he was younger, but there was always this sense that he probably did have ADHD. I sort of appreciated that when he was younger, that people weren't like jumping to diagnose him with anything. But that didn't help us, you know, with the issues that we had. So I guess technically he was diagnosed by Sarah when, you know, after he had gone through Camp Baker. And again, I would say, even though Camp Baker is designed for kids with ADHD, I didn't get the sense that there was ever really an interest in like over labeling him, which, you know, I appreciated. He does know that he has ADHD and kind of had an interesting reaction to it. I think he was pretty mad about it at first, and, you know, saw it as a label, but we've talked about it a lot that, you know, it's not anything that he's doing wrong. It's how his brain works, and his father has it too. So, you know, we talk about it as a strength, and, you know, and how it's not going to, it doesn't need to hold him back. It's just how his brain works differently. And I know that he has appreciated reading about it in, I think it's in Captain Underpants and in Dogman books, because that author, I think, has ADHD, and he has a character in the books that's called 80, like the number 80 HD. And he thinks that's really cute and funny. And I think he feels like a kind of kinship sort of with the books. Just the other day, I did hear him tell a friend that he has it. I'm not sure if that was supposed to be like an excuse or what it was, but it was kind of, you know, I think he's sort of come to terms with it. And I'm glad that we told him, because it's a lot easier to have him like on our team and like know what's going on than not.
So I think all three of ours were diagnosed by psychologists. They, I guess, all of them are currently on medications. They're all pretty complex kiddos. So they're all currently managed by a psychiatrist for their medications. And it kind of came down to, because they're all pretty complex. My oldest is autistic, and the two boys are the same age. They're both 7.5. And one is a little bit more severe than the other in terms of behaviors. And at the time we sort of started with Judge Baker was at the point where he was kind of in and like running down the halls at school and like leaving the school building and doing some pretty extreme behaviors. And so I can't remember who suggested it. I think it may have come up at one of the parent nights, as a matter of fact. But it was suggested that you just sort of, you don't make it kind of a taboo thing, because if you make it like a, oh, well, we don't talk about this thing, or it's this scary thing, or it's this thing that you know, that then it's something bad that they have. And we didn't want that for them. And we actually, the week that we heard that, we sat down that weekend with a whiteboard and we started with mom and dad, and we did on one side, how do you think mom struggles? What things do you think mom struggles with? And on the other side, we did, how do you think mom really does things that are really great? What things does mom do that are really great? And we went through each member of the family. And after we talked about each thing that each member of the family did really great and things that we struggled with, we talked about how can we support each other as members of the family. Like, okay, well, if you see your brother struggling with something, how could you support your brother? Well, if he's running down the hallway at the school and there's a teacher running after him, maybe you don't need to run after him. But, maybe if you see him sitting in the hallway crying, maybe you can pat him on the back. Those are two different types of situations. So we kind of walked through a couple of different scenarios, and we gave them the opportunity to label, to actually talk about what their letters were, what letters they would hear associated with themselves. And that way they know that if I'm talking to a doctor, if I'm talking to their psychiatrist or whatever, and I say, hey, his ODD's really been acting up, or his teacher says this about his ADHD, they know what I'm talking about, and it's okay. It's not this big bad boogeyman thing. It's just a thing.
Thank you so much to each of you. We really think that sort of having open conversations with kids about mental health is a really great way to reduce stigma and empower them to understand just the differences in how their brains work. And just like Jesse said, sort of putting a label to sort of the cluster of things that they already know are going on that's different for them. I actually just worked with a 8-year-old girl and her mom last Friday to tell her a little bit about having ADHD. And we did kind of exactly what Jesse said, what's great about how my brain and my body works and what's really difficult about it. And she talked about her wiggles and how she gets silly and how all the other kids notice. And, we just said, you know what, that's actually something called ADHD. And we spent some time looking up famous people who have ADHD, and that's some of her homework. And, Michael Phelps and Justin Timberlake and Simone Biles are some of those really, incredible and successful people. And, we just got really, really curious about it. And I think for her, it was kind of like, oh yeah, that's just what this is called. I've called it my wiggles or my sillies before. And people like Dr. Sarah call it ADHD. So I really appreciate you sharing all of your stories, and it sounds like a really similar type of conversation. And, Jesse, I'm just smiling a little bit thinking about a panel that we were on earlier this year when Noel, who was 7 at the time, talked to a group of Harvard undergraduate students. And he actually did a breakdown of the brain and talked about how, because he has ADHD, his prefrontal cortex hasn't developed as much yet. And these Harvard students are like writing the information down, like, wow, this kid knows so much about neuroanatomy. And so, I think we get so nervous about having these conversations with kids, but it's really empowering, and it just helps sort of close the loop on a story that they know about, but they don't have the words to really explain it. So thank you, for sharing that with us. While I have the mic, and before I ask you sort of our final closing question, I do want to give a shout out to our postdoc, Leah Guterman, who is in the call. And she was actually a Camp Baker counselor 2 summers ago, and she's come and she's with us for an entire year doing psychotherapy at CECT, and then she'll be at Camp Baker with us next year. Hi, Leah. Thank you for putting your video on. And she's made some wonderful handouts and fact sheets for us. So one of them is about ADHD as a superpower and talks about all the great benefits of having ADHD. And one of them is about talking to your kids about having ADHD. So you might be wondering, like, where do I find this information? How do I get these cool documents to share with my kid? And we have, thanks to Leah again, and Alex's help, we have a new Camp Baker Instagram. So I'll put the Instagram handle in our chat. We also have a resource page on our Judge Baker website and on our Camp Baker website. So we want to just have the opportunity to communicate and connect with you guys, because we really want to get this information out so you can keep having this type of dialogue. One last little thing before I turn to our final question is, there are a lot of complexities with ADHD. Jesse is talking about that. Millie, was mentioning other challenges that Javier has had. Sarah was talking about anxiety. We're talking about social skills. And so kids with ADHD rarely just have ADHD. And it does not come in a vacuum. And in fact, the American Academy of Pediatrics revised their guidelines about ADHD this past year to include something called complex ADHD. And that basically means what you all with lived experience know is that ADHD comes with a lot of other stuff. So there are some things that Leah is also helping me spearhead at the clinic, like something called organizational skills training. We'll be offering groups and individual organizational skills training. I think Millie and Javier really benefited from that. So that's for older kids to help them learn how to organize, plan their schoolwork, figure out how long it takes to do assignments, how to prioritize and structure their work assignments. And I think this is particularly helpful to be thinking about, especially during COVID, when many kids are doing school remotely and there's lots of logins and lots of different screens and things to navigate for your kiddos. So Camp Baker is sort of our #1 ADHD program, but there are a lot of services that you can access year round that can help support kids who have ADHD. And again, kids with ADHD often have problems with anxiety, with social skills, and we offer all sorts of supports for that year round at our outpatient clinic as well. All right, so my final question for all of you is, if you had advice for parents of kids with ADHD, what would you tell them?
I think this one's pretty easy for me. And this is the one that came up at the Harvard panel. And I think I remember, Millie, you were there, weren't you? At the Harvard panel? No?
Not that one. No.
I was thinking that she was. Anyway, my #1 piece of advice is whenever you're angry at your child, whenever your child is acting out, whenever that you're frustrated, to let your number one place to go to be empathy, to suggest to your teachers to let their number one place to go with your child to be empathy. When you look at your child's teachers, to have empathy for them and their position with your child. That little bit of empathy for your child will go so far in helping you see just what position they're in. You know, if you think about your brain running 10,000 miles an hour and, you know, bouncing from place to place, and how difficult that must make life, and how hard it must be to focus on that one thing that person is asking you to do, you know, to just breathe and try to simplify it. And that empathy makes life so much easier for the kiddos, and it makes your life easier, and it makes everything so much more positive and happy. So
I'll go next. Definitely empathy. Yes, I agree 100%. But I guess what I would have to say, and this comes really from being in Judge Baker with 2 years now, is praise. Praise your child, because I noticed there was a huge difference when we stopped looking at the things that he didn't do the way we wanted him to, or that caught the wrong attention. As soon as we switch to praising instead, oh my gosh, it was night and day. He became this better person, and he loved the praise, and he strived for that, and he tried so much harder. So just make sure, like, when your child is doing, ignore the negative, but when he does something great, please let him know, because then he'll keep doing it. And that was one of my biggest take from doing the different therapies in Judge Baker. Praise your child, and of course accept him for who he is. And you look at him and you're like, oh my God, you're so smart. And you know, sometimes they do, but that's who they are. Love them for who they are, but definitely praise them as much as you can.
And I think what I would say, I mean, I totally agree with what Jesse and Millie said, and I would just add that I think that that you don't have to struggle. I mean, it's hard, right? But I guess I would say there are really good resources out there, and I felt for a long time that there was like nothing that was going to help us. And I think it's important to know that there are resources out there that are evidence based, that really work, that are relatively easy to implement. You know, hard to keep up, but relatively easy to implement. And you don't have to feel isolated and feel alone and feel like you don't know what you're doing. Um, so I guess I would, I mean, I sound like I guess this is a good way to end because I'm just plugging Judge Baker, but you know, I would really recommend that if you're not already working with them, that you do, because it's really been really life changing for our family.
Well, thank you so much for especially the three of you, and for all of you. You know, I know it's after work and dinner time, and we're competing with, you know, medication wearing off, and the desire for all your awesome attention. But thank you so much for the wealth of knowledge and just vulnerability and, you know, information that you shared. I think like I learned a lot, and I know the three of you really, really well. And so I think this was probably invaluable to the people who chimed in and listened. And thank you just for being so open about your experience and your journey and what it's been like for you and your family. And, you know, I hope that for all of you on this, or anyone who's looking at this at another time when we post it, that you are able to connect with us. Even if we don't have the resources, we will help you find the right resources for your child and family. And we definitely want to help connect families, as many as we can, with available resources so that you don't have to struggle and that you can find that empathy and praise for your child, because that's hard to do when things feel like, you know, it's just never a good interaction and you're always like pulling your hair out, not sure, you know, how to get through, you know, the next minute, let alone hour or day. So thank you guys so much. Please follow us on Instagram and on Facebook and connect to some of our resources pages. We have lots of services available for sleep problems, eating problems, all sorts of things that you might not think of as normal sort of therapy services. So if you think we might be able to help, please send us an email or give us a call. And thank you again to our awesome panel and for Leah and Alex for helping set this up. Have a great evening.